I was called to investigate a decommissioned submarine. Strange things happened there. They always said there would come a day when the past would catch up with me, not in the dramatic sense of revenge or reckoning, but in the subtle, suffocating manner of a memory too well buried clawing its way back into relevance. That day arrived not with sirens or urgency, but with a quiet call routed through 3 disconnected offices before it reached my desk in a basement that smelled of mold and resignation. My clearance had been dormant for over a decade, my service file locked in some drawer labeled non-essential, and the name of the agency that contacted me hadn't been spoken aloud in over 20 years. I recognized the voice instantly, though it had aged into gravel and tension. It belonged to a man I thought had died in '97, Commander Hewson. His voice was brittle with static, but the words were clear. "We found it." And then, almost as if to assure me I hadn't misunderstood, he said, "The Aronnax. It's surfaced." My spine straightened with the involuntary reflex of old training, even though I hadn't been active in 2 administrations. I asked where it had been found. Silence for a beat. Then, Dock C-29, the restricted port off Valmar's End. You know it. I did. I had been there once, in the dark days of cleanup operations after a Cold War experiment went so deeply wrong we were told to forget it by force if necessary. No one was supposed to know Dock C-29 still existed, much less be operational. I asked who else was being sent. Another pause. "Just you." That silence said more than his words ever could. I hadn't been selected. I'd been isolated. 2 days later, after a flight routed through 3 cities under a fake name and an escort that never removed their sunglasses, I found myself standing on the wind-blasted concrete of Dock C-29. The Atlantic swelled beneath steel walkways, and the cold air stank of oxidized metal and long-dead engines. At the far end of the dock, tethered like a corpse laid out for inspection, was the object that had refused to stay buried. The Aronnax was a Los Angeles-class attack submarine officially lost during maneuvers in 1989, declared sunk with all hands after a catastrophic systems failure off the Mariana Trench. There had been a service. There had been medals. There had been silence. And yet there it was, fully intact, no rust, no damage visible from the outside, its hull number sharp as a knife cut into its side. SSN 804. I wasn't alone on the dock, though none of the others spoke. There were 6 of them, clad in dark naval uniforms with insignias I didn't recognize, standing at equal distances like chess pieces guarding something sacred or cursed. They didn't greet me, didn't acknowledge me. I wasn't meant to speak to them. A man in a civilian suit approached instead, his features indistinct, as if designed by committee. Harmless, forgettable. He introduced himself as Director Rell from Maritime Recovery Oversight, a department I knew didn't exist in any official ledger. He didn't shake my hand. He handed me a folder. Inside were black and white stills of the Aronnax from a satellite pass 4 days prior, anchored precisely where it sat now. The timestamps were impossible. It had surfaced sometime around 03:11 a.m. local time. The time didn't strike me until later. He told me the submarine hadn't just appeared. It had been there for some time, but only visible now. Sonar buoys hadn't picked it up. It had no heat signature, no EM activity. It had simply been discovered by accident, by a private security drone investigating an unrelated wreck. The interior had not yet been explored. They wanted me to be the first. Not because I was the best, they made that clear, but because I had served in the Atlantic Submarine Division in the late '80s, and more specifically, had been part of the other Aronnax investigation. The one that was buried. The one they denied existed. They said my familiarity with the original logs, the architecture, the crew structure, might help in establishing what had happened. I wasn't naive enough to believe that. They sent me because I was expendable, but useful. And maybe, just maybe, they thought I'd already been compromised by the past. I suited up an hour later in a modified naval environmental suit, airtight, scrubbed for biological contaminants, rigged with an oxygen feed independent of the sub's systems. That alone told me something had spooked them. The sub's power levels were reading as active. The reactor was still functional, but they didn't trust the air inside. No one said the word infection, but it hung in the air like smoke. They lowered me through the conning tower, hatch opening with a hiss that sounded too eager, and I descended into a tomb that shouldn't exist. The silence inside was total. Not the silence of dead systems or powered-down machinery, but the kind of silence that bends inward on itself, thick with anticipation. My boots echoed against the metal grating. The interior lights were on. Pale, yellowed fluorescence hummed above, flickering slightly but steady enough to illuminate everything. Nothing was dusty. There was no sign of age. No mold. No corrosion. It was like stepping into a memory someone had tried to freeze-frame forever. The control panels were pristine. Charts lay open on the navigation table. A steaming mug of coffee sat beside a chair, as if someone had just stood up seconds before, but it was cold to the touch. Everything was exactly as it had been the moment the crew vanished, as if time had been halted. I moved through the command deck, calling out names from the manifest, hoping for an echo, a voice, anything. My comms remained eerily quiet, even from the outside team. I requested a line check. No response. My vitals were still transmitting. The telemetry blinked green, but there was no sound. The silence wasn't just environmental. It was deliberate. Manufactured. I descended deeper into the sub, toward the officers' quarters, where more impossible details awaited me. Every bunk was made. Personal effects remained. A game of chess left in mid-play. A copy of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea lay open on a desk with a bookmark labeled Day 43. I checked the last log entries. The date read April 17, 1989. My fingers began to tremble, not from fear, but from a creeping recognition. That was the day before the sub had gone missing. Then I found something that wasn't supposed to be there. A slip of paper pinned to the wall above the captain's quarters. It wasn't aged. The ink hadn't faded. But the paper was torn along the edge like it had been ripped from something older. It read in blocky handwriting, "Don't let the time change you." That phrase struck something dormant in my mind, like the echo of a dream I'd almost forgotten. I had heard it once before, during a debriefing after an operation I was never supposed to recall. I folded the note into my logbook and moved on, unease thickening with each step. I wasn't alone in the submarine, not in the conventional sense, but in the way shadows seemed to hesitate before following me, in the way doors creaked open just a little farther than I'd left them. In the way, behind the hum of fluorescent lights, I could hear something breathing. When I finally returned topside, hours later, or minutes, I couldn't be sure, the sky looked exactly the same as when I'd gone in. The sun had not moved. The watch on my wrist, synced to an atomic clock before descent, read 0311. And it was then that I realized I had never truly left the Aronnax the first time. The coordinates led me to a forgotten edge of the coast. A rust-eaten military dock surrounded by barbed fences that hadn't seen electricity in years. The wind there didn't howl. It moaned low, like a voice trying to forget how to speak. As I walked along the cracked concrete, dragging behind me the reluctant echo of my boots, I could already feel something off, something too still. The sea itself held its breath, waves pulling back as though the very water feared what had been pulled ashore. There, impossibly real before me, was the Leviathan, a Cold War-era submarine whose last known transmission had been in 1989, before it was declared lost with all hands during a classified mission beneath the Barents Sea. I had studied its file years ago, the one with entire paragraphs redacted and smeared in ink. It had been presumed destroyed, scattered across the ocean floor, entombed by pressure and time. And yet it sat here now, silent and unchained, its flaking black hull glinting with salt and condensation under a milky, apathetic sky. The dock had no records of activity. The security logs were blank. No cranes, no sonar scans, no satellite images showed how it had returned. It had simply appeared, as if surfaced from a memory no one remembered having. No crew stood on its deck. No hatches were open, but there were footprints. Fresh ones, too many to count, pressed into the rust and sea salt, not leading away from the sub, but circling it, again and again, in tangled loops like someone, or several, had been pacing restlessly. I tried the radio first. Static. Then the external speaker system. Nothing but a low, rumbling tone that made my jaw ache. My team, a 3-man unit cobbled together in haste, stood beside me, visibly shaken but silent. Harris, the youngest, kept glancing at the sky as if expecting something to descend. Kowalski, the only one older than me, knelt beside the hull and placed his palm flat against the metal. "Still warm," he whispered, eyes wide. That was impossible. The reactor should have been dead for decades. When we finally forced open the outer hatch, it exhaled. Not just air, but something denser, older, like the smell of old paper and burnt copper. We entered. Flashlights sweeping narrow corridors and preserved insignia. The lights inside flickered on one by one without us touching a single control. Emergency bulbs lit in sickly orange hues, casting long shadows that moved half a second too late. Dust particles floated mid-air, but there was no dust to kick up. The air was clean. Too clean. As if the place had been sealed yesterday. But that wasn't the strangest part. Every single clock on board, digital, analog, wristwatches left carelessly on bunks, read exactly the same, 0311. Each second hand ticked in unison, but when we blinked, they reset. Again and again. 0311. We checked 5 clocks, 10, 17. The same. In the mess hall, trays of food lay abandoned mid-meal. A bowl of beet soup, still gelatinous. Bread with visible teeth marks. Cups of something black and congealed. Not rotten, but perfectly preserved. Refrigeration had long since failed. And yet everything inside resisted decay. I touched the surface of a slice of meat. It gave under my finger, still moist. Harris threw up. I didn't blame him. A sense of wrongness hung here like mold. But not on the walls, in the air itself, humming through our teeth, tightening our throats. The silence wasn't silent. It had a frequency. The crew quarters told the same story. Beds still made, uniforms folded neatly. Books half read on bunks, pages marked with handwritten notes in Russian, English, and something else I couldn't place. A language made of curves and hooks and strokes that didn't obey known grammar. A journal on one bed simply read, "It follows sound. Stop breathing." I didn't know if it was a metaphor or a warning. Then came the control room. Pristine. Instruments alive. Dials twitching under invisible hands. Sonar pinging regularly. Yet nothing was touched. No fuel levels. No reactor hum. No navigation systems online. Just the illusion of functionality. Like a stage set perfectly for a show that had already ended, waiting for actors to take their places again. At the center console sat a chair facing away from us. I hesitated before stepping forward. My shadow fell across it, and the chair creaked. Slowly, I turned it. Nothing sat there. But on the seat, embedded deep into the cushion, was a perfect, fresh indentation. Someone had just been there. Harris backed into a panel and activated a monitor by accident. Static turned to image, and what we saw froze all movement in our bodies. A live feed. From the torpedo bay. The room was empty. Then something moved, slowly, behind a tarp. A shape too large to be human. The feed cut. Kowalski turned to me, pale. How was that possible? There's no power. We didn't even touch the reactor. I tried to speak, but my mouth had dried. My tongue felt too large, too foreign. Then a voice echoed faintly through the halls. Not through the comms, but through the metal itself. A woman's voice. Repeating one phrase in Russian over and over. None of us spoke it fluently, but we knew enough to understand. Return to your stations. Again. Return to your stations. And again. Until it faded, replaced by that low-frequency hum that lived in the walls. I looked at my watch. 03:11. I took it off and crushed it under my boot. When I looked back at the wall clock in the mess, 03:11, we should have left. But we didn't. Because the outer hatch, the one we entered through, was sealed from the outside. Welded shut. Metal that hadn't been there before. We tried the radio again. Only static. Except, not quite. Beneath the static, just low enough that it slipped under your conscious hearing, there was breathing. Our breathing. Replayed to us, fractionally delayed. But then, new breaths joined. Ones we weren't taking. Inhalations from more lungs than we had. Harris dropped the receiver and ran for the hallway, his light bouncing wildly. We found him later, staring into a mirror he swore hadn't been there before. He kept saying, "That's not my face. That's not my face." But it was. It looked exactly like him. Until we blinked. Then it smiled. We were no longer investigators. We were no longer ourselves. We were participants in something scripted before we ever stepped on deck. The Leviathan had not returned. It had been waiting to open its mouth. And we, unknowingly, had climbed inside. Inside the submarine, the walls whispered with temperature. Just warm enough to mimic life. Cold enough to remind us it had none. The corridors narrowed as we pressed forward, flashlight beams dancing over pipes and cables that snaked across the ceiling like calcified veins. Every corner turned, every bulkhead passed, gave birth to a fresh sense of compression. Not claustrophobia in the physical sense, but a mental one. As though the space around our thoughts was shrinking. As if the very air whispered constraints we couldn't name. It wasn't just the size of the place. It was the sense that we weren't alone, despite the total absence of motion or breath beyond our own. Time failed to pass properly down there. No matter how often I checked my wrist, the watch stared back at me with the same frozen numbers. 03:11. And it wasn't just the clocks. It was in the way sound echoed, or didn't. Footsteps rang when no one walked. The air hummed when we held our breath. I began to wonder if the time was stuck, or if we were. The deeper we pushed, the more vivid the preservation became. We reached the galley first, and it was wrong. A table still bore signs of a meal, cutlery laid precisely, dishes filled but untouched, a bottle of vodka uncapped and half poured into 2 glasses. One chair was pulled slightly back, as if its owner had stood to leave mid-sentence, mid-thought, mid-chew. Mold should have claimed the space long ago, but it hadn't. No roaches, no mildew, no dust on the floor. It wasn't just clean, it was curated. Curated by something that didn't know what humans feared, but understood the shape of memory. Harris reached for the bottle, just to test it, and I snapped at him. But he'd already touched it. He sniffed. "Smells like fruit," he said, then paused. "No, like something sweet going sour." He didn't drink, but his eyes lingered too long on the glass. We moved on. The crew quarters mirrored the galley in uncanny silence. Bunks made, lockers shut tight, each labeled with neat Cyrillic tags. Some had small decorations, snapshots of children, faded drawings, a dog-eared copy of Moby Dick in English, with Russian notes scribbled in the margins. One bunk was different. The sheets were torn. The mattress was missing. In its place, scratched into the steel floor, were concentric circles drawn again and again, almost violently. Some of the grooves were deep enough to catch a fingernail. A crumpled piece of paper rested in the center, stuck there by what looked like melted wax. It simply read, "She hears through the walls." I didn't tell the others. I simply pocketed the note. It felt like a sin to leave it behind. The next section was the officers' quarters. Kowalski found a wardrobe open. Inside hung a uniform, immaculate, pressed, too pristine for its age. On the lapel, Commander A. Redchenko, a name I recognized from the blacked-out files, the one marked, "Deceased, pending confirmation." His room was Spartan. A chessboard sat on a metal desk, mid-game. White bishop threatening black queen. An ashtray held 3 cigarette butts arranged neatly in a line. The smell was faint but unmistakable. Fresh smoke. That's when we heard it. 3 soft knocks on the doorframe. Not from behind us, but from inside the room, just behind the wardrobe door. Harris swung his light. Nothing there. The wardrobe, empty. I opened it again. Still just the uniform. Still just dead air. We shut the door behind us. But the knocking resumed, this time further down the hallway. And this time, it was 5 knocks. A rhythm. Intentional. The control room came next. I've been inside dozens of Cold War subs, museums, wrecks, blueprints, but this one, it was alive. The control panels weren't just lit. They reacted. Dials spun slowly of their own accord, and every time we spoke, a corresponding needle trembled, like the ship was listening, like it was measuring us. The main console blinked through old data logs, not with digital timestamps, but with symbols, shapes, spirals, scripts we didn't recognize. When Kowalski attempted to press one of the blinking keys, the system powered down immediately, as though scolding him. Lights dimmed, then slowly returned. One monitor flickered with static, and for a moment it showed a face. Pale, mouth open, eyes wide, no uniform. It vanished before we could say a word. Then we found the mess of cables. Not standard ship issue, but something different. Woven with copper and glass, spiraling into a sealed hatch in the floor that wasn't on any blueprint. The hatch was locked tight, but the handle turned freely, uselessly. No bolts, no keypad, no indication of how to open it. On the metal surface, someone had written in thick red marker, "Never, never, never." The words repeated in slanted lines across the lid. written in frantic layers, overlapping each other like someone kept returning to reinforce the message. We didn't open it. We didn't even try. But I could feel it beneath us, whatever it held. A sound, not a vibration, not a noise, but a frequency in the bones. The same one we'd heard since stepping aboard. 0311. Before we left that section, Harris pointed to a speaker above us. "Listen," he said. I heard nothing. Then he pressed his ear to the metal. "It's repeating something," he whispered. I climbed up beside him and listened. Faint, mechanical. A voice filtered through distortion. It wasn't English, not Russian, not anything I knew, but it had rhythm, cadence, like prayer slowed to a crawl. And then, suddenly, as if it knew I was there, it stopped, and whispered a single word in perfect English. "Breathe." We regrouped in the central hallway. That's when we noticed the lights had dimmed. Not failed. Dimmed. Not all at once, but gradually, as though trying to lull us into forgetting. Kowalski's flashlight wouldn't turn off. He didn't even touch the switch. It simply stayed on, the beam slowly narrowing, intensifying, until the lens cracked and the light died with a pop. We carried on in partial darkness. I didn't realize until much later that the light had burned a perfect circle into the metal wall where it last pointed. And in that circle, etched deep as if revealed by heat, the number 0311, burned into steel, a mark that hadn't been there before. We tried to find the aft section. Doors led to doors, corridors fed into themselves. We looped. Once, twice, 3 times. Always returning to the mess hall. Always finding the table set again. The glasses refilled. The vodka bottle uncapped. No matter what we moved, it was back in place next time we saw it. As though the ship refused our interference. Refused our logic. I caught Harris staring at his reflection in a porthole window, staring too long. "It's different," he muttered. "It's doing things I'm not doing." I pulled him away. But even I had noticed it. His hand moved. The reflection moved after. We weren't inside a submarine. We were inside a trap shaped like one. A structure built by men, but no longer owned by them. Something else had taken root here. Something that wore familiarity like skin. Something that needed us to keep going deeper. I no longer believed we could just leave. I started to think we were never supposed to. And the clock still read 0311. There was a moment, after the 3rd day inside the sub, when I began to question if the silence itself was alive. A presence, cloaked in stillness, watching me from every pipe and bulkhead. I had spent those days cataloging what should have been left behind by the men who once called this place home. Footsteps worn into the steel, scuffed panels, pages torn from manuals, but found none of it. What I did have were their names. Names pulled from old black and white dossiers retrieved by the agency before my deployment. There were 27 of them, all listed as active personnel, MIA. Not deceased, not recovered. Simply missing in a way that didn't follow protocol. I had studied those names on the flight over. Commander Harris, Lieutenant Daniels, Ensign Murakami. By the time I reached the 27th, Petty Officer James Lang, their faces had already become abstract shadows in my mind. Now, standing inside their ghost ship, their absence felt deliberate, like they'd been peeled away from history with surgical precision. I searched the sleeping quarters first. The bunks were all made, tight folds, regulation perfect, not a sheet out of place. Lockers stood closed, most locked, but even the open ones held only uniforms folded like they'd been ironed hours ago. No loose pictures of family, no magazines, no wrappers, no smell of men. The air was too clean, sterile, almost clinical. The kind of emptiness that doesn't come from time or abandonment, but from cleansing, intentional and thorough. I took note of a curious detail. Every locker had its owner's nameplate. None were scratched or faded, as if time had refused to pass through here. I tried to match names with the dossiers. They all aligned. Every crew member listed had once slept here, but not one had left behind a fingerprint. I moved on to the command deck. The logbooks were still in place, bound in navy blue leather, embossed with the old seal. I opened them. The entries stopped on June 3, 1989, 0311 a.m. Every clock on the ship mirrored that same frozen moment, as though the entire vessel had been ripped from the flow of time and nailed to that single second. The last log was brief. Entering Zone B12 as scheduled. Unidentified signal received. Orders to investigate. That was it. No coordinates, no further entries. Just a closing line written in smaller, almost hesitant handwriting. We are not alone down here. I played back the security feed from that night. Most of the tapes had degraded or were corrupted, but a few remained intact. The images were murky, static-laced, as though some magnetic interference had bled through the ship's entire surveillance system. Still, I watched. I watched the mess hall at 02:45 a.m. Crew members sitting in silence, not eating, just staring forward. One tapped his fork against a steel tray, rhythmically. Another had his hands folded in prayer, unmoving, unblinking. At 03:10, a low vibration shuddered through the image. Men stood. Some clutched their heads. Others simply froze. One by one, they turned toward the camera and smiled. Then the screen cut to black. I searched the escape logs. No hatches had been opened, no escape pods launched. The outer hull hadn't been breached. There was no indication anyone had left, or ever intended to. Yet there were no bodies. I looked for signs of foul play. Blood, torn uniforms, scratches on the walls. Nothing. It was as if the crew had been surgically extracted from reality, leaving behind only the scenery. In the infirmary, I found sealed medical kits, untouched IV bags, drawers full of sedatives that hadn't been disturbed. The biometric logs on the med scanner were empty, no heart rates, no DNA traces, as though the machine had never been used. I requested external validation, ran cross-checks with Global Naval Archives. But the files had been purged. Every mention of the crew had been removed post-1989. The system didn't show them as deceased. It didn't show them at all. One moment, they were part of a military mission. The next, not even ghosts, just holes in records where people used to be. And then came the personal layer. My own name. I searched it on the ship's internal personnel registry, out of instinct. It didn't exist. But there was a curious entry where the commanding officer's name should be. Instead of Commander Harris, it now read, "Awaiting confirmation. Identity pending." I blinked at that line for a long time. I had a dream that night, the kind that doesn't feel like dreaming. I was walking the narrow passageways, but the ship was different, wet, somehow breathing. The walls pulsed softly. My boots sloshed through a film of black water. And then I saw them. The crew. Not corpses. Not spirits. They were there, behind the glass of the sonar room, eyes wide and lips moving in unison, mouthing something I couldn't hear. I woke, gasping. Checked the sonar room. It was empty. But on the glass window that divided the control panel from the listening station, there were fingerprints. 27 of them. All from the inside. And still, not a single one matched any biometric profile on file. There is a kind of fear that seeps into your thoughts slowly, not through shock or horror, but by the quiet realization that the world no longer makes sense. That's what the crew had become. An unsolvable equation, a paradox carved into steel. They hadn't died. They hadn't escaped. They had been unmade, rewritten out of existence like a bad draft. And every day I remained aboard, I felt a pressure building in the air, like the submarine was remembering them piece by piece, drawing them back, reshaping the void where they had once stood. But if it could remember them, I wondered, could it forget me? And if it did, what would be left in my place? I recorded my findings. Uploaded encrypted copies to the agency server. No replies, no acknowledgements, not even a receipt of transmission. I was beginning to suspect that no one was on the other end anymore, or that whatever was had no intention of answering. As I closed the panel on the communication hub, the internal lights dimmed for precisely 1 second, all at once. And in that brief darkness, I thought I heard a footstep behind me. Just one. I turned. The corridor was empty, but the scent had changed. The sterile metallic air now carried something else. Sweat. Oil. A faint trace of breath. The kind of smell men leave behind when they haven't been gone at all. It started with a sound, one I initially mistook for the natural groan of steel under pressure, or the residual hum of dormant machinery left in standby. Submarines are alive in their own way, creaking and shifting as if they breathe through the hull. But this wasn't that. It wasn't random. It had a cadence, A whisper-thin rhythm that always returned to the same tonal curve, like a breath caught on repeat, laced with something too deliberate to be a fault of the ship's aging frame. I heard it first near the navigation console, a low murmur in the static of the disabled sonar feed. At first, I assumed it was interference, or the system's own death rattle bleeding into the speaker. But then it paused, waited, and repeated the same pattern, softer this time, as if testing the space between its own presence and my attention. It was not machine noise. It was a voice. No, several, layered and weaving through one another like seaweed caught in a current. Too quiet to decipher, too persistent to ignore. I traced the wires, trying to identify a feedback loop, some leftover charge caught in the circuitry. Everything was cold, disconnected. The sub's reactor hadn't powered up in decades. There should have been no internal audio input, let alone playback. And yet, as I moved through the corridors, the whispers followed, sometimes echoing faintly through the overhead pipes, sometimes slipping through the seams of closed bulkheads like breath escaping from a sealed lung. They would vanish the moment I turned my head, always a second too slow to catch their source. At night, if time could even be said to pass in a place like this, I lay in the bunk and listened to them pool in the corners of the cabin, like water flooding a compartment. They came in pulses, matching the beat of a heart not mine. The ship's old audio log system was still operational in part. Magnetic tapes sealed in reinforced capsules bolted into the wall for redundancy. They hadn't been wiped. I opened one labeled Internal Comms 0603-1989. The last recorded segment was exactly 13 minutes and 7 seconds long. It began normally, the hum of engines, clipped reports between crew, occasional laughter, the mundane soundtrack of military routine. Then, just after the 13-minute mark, the voice of Commander Harris barked, "All units, stand by. We're receiving," and the words cut off. What followed was silence. Not the absence of sound, but a low, oppressive nothingness, like a vacuum had collapsed over the tape. Then, softly at first, the whispers began. Indistinct, layered and rising, as if spoken from behind a wall of water. I listened to the full duration. They never ceased. They looped, folding back on themselves. No speaker could be identified. Just that same indecipherable repetition, as if someone, or something, was trapped in the act of speaking, but never finishing. When I rewound the tape and played it backward, I felt something shift in the pressure around me. The air became dense. The lights in the compartment flickered, just once, like a breath caught mid-inhale, and the tape crackled with static that wasn't there before. The whispers had reversed, yes, but they no longer sounded like speech. They became more urgent, animalistic, clicks and pops that evoked images not stored in memory but etched into some deeper, older place in the brain. I stopped the tape. The air cleared. The light steadied. But the presence remained, invisible yet undeniable, as if the ship had become aware that I was listening too closely. Driven by a need to make sense of it, I returned to the sonar chamber. The equipment there had no power, but I overrode the main panel and activated a localized microphone array. Against all logic, it still functioned. I connected the feed to my own headset and adjusted the filters, slowly eliminating background noise. That's when I heard it again. Clearer now. The same whispers, but more pronounced. And beneath them, something else. A tonal vibration, low and sustained, like a deep-sea call echoing from the bones of the vessel itself. It wasn't natural, it wasn't random. The waveform was structured, mathematical, almost like a language encoded not in syllables but in frequencies. A signal. I ran a spectrographic analysis. The visual output startled me. The frequencies plotted themselves into fractal shapes, recursive, organic patterns that spiraled inward toward a core of silence. No human speech creates symmetry like that. It was as if the sound itself had intention, geometry, motive. And within one of the denser clusters, the frequency plotted an unmistakable figure. The outline of the submarine. Perfectly rendered. As if the sound knew where it was, and what it inhabited. That was when I began to suspect the truth. Whatever was speaking was not in the submarine. It was the submarine. Or rather, it had embedded itself into the structure so completely that separation was no longer meaningful. The whispers were not from within, but of the hull, the metal itself carrying memory, transmitting thought. The ship had become its own transmitter. its own listener. I left the chamber reeling, ears ringing with echoes that no longer faded. Even when the headset was removed, I could still feel them, not in the air, but in the marrow of my bones. It was like tinnitus, but deeper, more rhythmic, an internal murmur shaping the contours of my perception. The longer I stayed, the more the whispers aligned with my own breath. I would speak and hear a half-second delay, a mirror whisper tracing my words in a voice not quite mine. My sleep became fractured. Dreams dissolved into a continuous hum, always circling the same image. A door beneath the ocean, cracked open, with voices spilling through like ink. I began to question the limits of my hearing, and then the boundaries of my mind. It was on the 5th night that I made the mistake of speaking back. In a moment of weakness, I said aloud, "What are you?" Not into the headset, just to the ship, to the air, to whatever listened. I hadn't expected a reply, but the lights dimmed again, 2 seconds this time, and a new whisper emerged. Not layered, not part of the ambient noise. Singular, female, calm. It said only one word, listening. Then silence returned. I don't know if I was ever alone on that ship. I don't know if the crew vanished, or if they became part of something larger. But I am certain of this. The submarine is not empty. It is occupied by thought, by echo, by something that once observed humans and decided to mimic the form of their voices, and eventually their presence. Every panel, every pipe, every corridor is now a conduit. And when I place my ear to the walls, I hear not just whispers, but breathing, as if something waits just behind the steel, just one layer deep, and all it needs is the right voice to answer. Maybe mine, maybe yours, or maybe one it's still forming, syllable by syllable, whisper by whisper, in the dark. I had combed through every blueprint the Navy had released to me, every cross-section, schematic, maintenance diagram, down to the emergency evacuation overlays printed decades ago on yellowing acetate. Each one rendered the submarine in full, with no variation. No dead zones, no sealed compartments, nothing unaccounted for. But if the whispers had taught me anything, it was that the submarine had never truly belonged to human engineering. There were parts of it that had learned to hide in plain sight. I discovered the anomaly on the 7th day, while tracking the resonance patterns from the internal piping system, trying to triangulate the origin of a deeper pulse that had begun emerging beneath the whisper layer. It wasn't random anymore. It struck every 23 minutes, precisely, like a heartbeat filtered through layers of decaying steel and memory. The acoustics led me to a wall between the crew quarters and the engine manifold, a junction that should have contained only conduits. But the pulse was strongest there, and when I placed my hand on the bulkhead, it was warm, alive. The panel was bolted over with mismatched rivets, painted over hurriedly, as if whoever sealed it wanted it forgotten, not reinforced. The bolts weren't in any known Navy pattern. I removed them one by one, expecting rust, maybe a collapsed cable shaft. Instead, the wall gave way to a round hatch. No insignia, no serials, no access code. Just smooth metal with a circular handle and 6 embedded points that looked eerily like fingers. When I touched them, the hatch clicked. Not outward, but inward, sliding back with a hydraulic hiss that sounded more like exhalation than machinery. What lay beyond wasn't in any of the files. It wasn't even in the legends whispered by old submariners. It was a chamber, perfectly spherical. No corners, no edges. The walls were not steel but something else. Darker, matte, textured like volcanic glass. The air was colder, denser, and carried the faint scent of ozone and something metallic, like blood. It was a silence unlike any I had felt in the rest of the ship. It didn't feel like the absence of sound. It felt like sound was not allowed here. There was no furniture, no instruments, nothing that looked remotely operational. But etched into the walls were symbols, hundreds, maybe thousands, burned into the surface with perfect symmetry. No two alike, yet all drawn with the same depth, the same curved precision, as if engraved not by hand but by thought. They pulsed slightly when I passed a light over them. Not visually, optically they remained static. But I could feel the vibration in my molars, a resonance like a tuning fork struck beneath the skin. Some of them resembled scripts I had seen in ancient texts, Etruscan, Linear A, even cuneiform, but warped, refracted through geometries too alien to decode. At the center of the chamber, there was a depression in the floor, just a few inches deep. It held a thin layer of water, salted, perfectly still, with no visible source. But when I stepped near, the surface shifted, not in ripples, but in images. The water showed a coastline, one I didn't recognize, under a night sky not our own. 3 moons, one cracked, drifted above a black sea. Figures moved along the shore, tall, slender, not quite bipedal. They carried something between them, not a person, not an object, but a light, opaque, slow, pulsing in rhythm with the sound I had followed here. When I blinked, the image vanished. The water was flat again. I bent down to touch it, and the moment my skin broke the surface, a pressure spiked behind my eyes, and my vision blurred not outward but inward. I was no longer looking at the room. I was within it, before it had walls, before it had form. It wasn't a room. It was a container, a holding cell, a membrane folded inward to contain something not meant for linear space. The symbols were not decoration. They were locks, and they were old. Older than the submarine. Older than any vessel built by our kind. When I pulled back, gasping, the chamber lights flickered to life. I hadn't noticed them before. Slits along the ceiling, emitting a dim violet glow that cast no shadows. The temperature dropped further. My breath fogged the air in perfect synchronization with the rhythm I had tracked. I realized then the pulse had never been mechanical. It had always been biological, or perhaps something mimicking biology. The chamber was not dormant. It was waiting. For activation, for recognition, for entry. That's when I noticed my reflection, not on the water, but on the far side of the wall. The glass-like surface mirrored my silhouette, but wrong. Subtle at first. The head was slightly tilted. The arms hung too straight. The face lacked detail. No mouth, no eyes. Just the suggestion of features, like a clay model waiting to be sculpted into something familiar. I stepped closer, and the reflection didn't move. It stayed frozen, studying me without motion, without sound. Then, with no visible shift, the symbols on the wall behind it began to glow, one by one, in a sequence that flowed not in a line, but in a spiral. As each lit up, I felt my pulse sink with the chamber, until the boundary between body and metal, between thought and resonance, began to blur. I staggered back, and the reflection finally moved, perfectly synchronized with my retreat. It smiled, not with lips, but with intent. I left the room without looking back. I sealed the hatch. I welded it shut. That night, the whispers changed. They no longer came from the ship or from the pipes. They came from the edge of sleep, just before my thoughts dissolved. A voice, clearer now, feminine, low, layered like multiple mouths speaking through one larynx. It whispered only once, "He sees you now," and then silence. In the morning, I checked the blueprints again. The junction had vanished. The schematic showed no sealed compartment, no structural anomaly. I returned to the spot. The wall was seamless. No bolts, no markings, just smooth steel, as if the room had never existed, or had been withdrawn. Not from the ship, but from me. I was no longer the observer. I was now part of the equation. The symbols had read me, logged me, registered me. And somewhere behind a mirrored wall in a room that couldn't exist, something shaped like me was still standing there, watching, learning, preparing. I hadn't slept in 3 days, and yet something pulled me from my makeshift cot just after the lights flickered again at 03:11. A now familiar tremor echoing deep inside the hull like the submarine itself was exhaling. I stumbled down the corridor, past pipes that groaned in whispers and overhead valves that dripped with the same salt water that didn't belong. My flashlight began to dim the moment I crossed into the lower decks, which had supposedly been sealed since the late 80s. But the lock had already been broken, not recently. There was corrosion along the edges, as if time itself had warped the mechanism into submission. Inside was a service alcove lined with dusty maintenance lockers, most empty or filled with relics too old to function. But the second one on the left refused to open at first. It took 3 tries, and when it did, the door let out a sigh, not mechanical but hollow, like the release of something long forgotten. At the bottom, tucked between 2 rusted manuals, was a small leather-bound notebook that had no serial, no classification mark, Nothing military at all. Just a strap holding it shut, swollen slightly with age. The pages were brittle but intact, the ink faded but legible, written in a hurried scrawl that shifted tone the deeper I read. The first entries were simple logs, dates, times, routine maintenance notes from someone identifying only as RC, an enlisted sonar technician assigned to monitor frequency anomalies during a classified mission in 1988. The entries matched records I'd been denied access to, which meant whoever this was, he'd survived long enough to document what hadn't been reported. The tone changed on page 6. RC mentioned pulses that the equipment began picking up on the third day at sea. Rhythmic, subharmonic vibrations not generated by machinery, but by something deep and constant, like the heartbeat of the trench itself. He said the signal didn't behave like sonar, didn't bounce back. It entered the array and stayed there, looping endlessly inside the receiver, warping the instruments with each cycle. He began describing headaches, shared among the crew, dreams filled with shapes he couldn't describe but attempted to sketch. Those drawings were crude, but unmistakably similar to the symbols etched inside the locked chamber I'd found just days ago. The deeper into the journal I read, the less structured the writing became. Grammar broke down, handwriting grew erratic. RC began referring to himself in the third person, then in plural, then not at all. Just images, phrases, references to the sound as the source and the pulse before language. He claimed the signal had started to sync with brainwave patterns, and that several crew members had begun to speak in unison during sleep, reciting lines in unknown dialects, one of which he noted phonetically, Athis korem vel adruun. I didn't recognize the language, but the shape of the syllables felt eerily close to the chant we'd picked up days ago on the torpedo room's broken radio. The diary ended abruptly with an entry dated March 11, 1989, the exact day the sub had vanished according to declassified logs. The final words were scrawled so deeply into the page the pen had nearly torn through. One must stay. That is the deal. One must stay so the gate stays shut. No signature. No farewell. The moment I closed the book, something in the locker shifted. I thought it was just metal creaking, but the sound repeated. Slow, deliberate, like breathing. I stepped back and scanned the compartment, but there was nothing else there. No air vents, no speakers. Still, I could feel the presence of something aware, not malevolent, but old, like the residual heat of a fire long extinguished. I took the diary to my quarters and began cross-referencing the coordinates scribbled in the margins, half-erased numbers written beside timestamps and what I assumed were decibel readings. They didn't match any standard sonar data, but when I ran them through a Cold War-era frequency modulation algorithm, they mapped into a pattern, not in 2 dimensions, but 3. A spiral, receding inward. When plotted against the known positions of hydrothermal vents in the mid-Atlantic, the pattern formed a corridor, an undersea trench whose deepest point had never been officially explored. RC believed whatever was transmitting had been sealed there centuries ago, and the submarine's mission had not been to patrol, but to deliver something, or someone. That night, the whispering returned, but this time I recognized a cadence from the journal's phonetic lines. I repeated them aloud without thinking, and as I did, the air grew still. Not silent, still, as if the ship itself had paused. The lighting shifted subtly, acquiring a faint red hue, like a blood vessel illuminated from within. My pulse slowed, not from fear, but from synchronization. I realized too late that the diary hadn't been left behind. It had been placed. For me. The locker that held it didn't exist on any inventory. The compartment had resealed itself after I left. And now, wherever I walked, I felt the echo of those final pages dragging behind me like a shadow that wasn't mine. I tried to tell command. I tried to send a report, a signal, anything to confirm what I had found. But the radio only looped the same message. Not mine. Not even English. Just the same voice repeating, "He who reads becomes the hinge." I'm beginning to forget my own handwriting. I see other entries now, ones I didn't write, appearing between the lines. The ink is fresh, and I don't remember holding the pen. I was beginning to lose track of the days. The sun never touched the interior of the vessel, and even the clocks, those that hadn't frozen at 0311, seemed to tick in irregular rhythms, as though the submarine operated by a different definition of time altogether. My meals came from ration packs decades expired yet strangely preserved, tasteless and textureless, the nutritional value meaningless in a place where hunger felt more like memory than need. I was reviewing the journal again, tracing the spiral diagram over and over, when the intercom crackled to life. It had been dead for days. No one else had access. Yet the voice was unmistakably human, calm, precise. "I need to speak to the officer in charge." That's what it said. I didn't respond. I moved quickly through the dim corridors toward the main hatch, expecting a prank, a hallucination, anything but what I found. A man in full naval uniform, standing just beyond the airlock, unarmed, helmet tucked under one arm, posture impeccable. The badge on his chest was nearly dissolved from salt, but I could still make out the rank, Chief Systems Operator. I buzzed open the door manually, expecting a rush of cold air, but none came. The man stepped inside as though he'd never left. And he looked at me with eyes that were almost familiar. Blue, too blue. Like the faded letters on a sun-bleached map. He saluted. "Permission to come aboard, sir," he said. There was no protocol for this. I asked his name. He replied, "Raymond Charles." The initials hit me like a hammer. R.C., the author of the journal. The man who'd supposedly vanished with the original crew. The man who, by all documentation, was 32 years old when this ship disappeared in 1989. And he still was. Same complexion. Same voice. Same photograph from the personnel file I'd found buried in the archives. He hadn't aged a day. Not a wrinkle. Not a tremor in his hand. He walked the halls like muscle memory guided him, making turns before I could direct him, nodding at rooms that hadn't been marked for decades. He paused outside the torpedo bay and tilted his head. "Still here?" he whispered, as if addressing something alive. I asked him where he had been. He ignored the question. I demanded identification. He offered none. Instead, he recited the entire maintenance manifest of the sub by heart, including sections that were redacted even in my clearance level. I tried to corner him with temporal references, political events, technological advancements, world leaders. He offered nothing. But every time I mentioned a year past 1989, he blinked slowly, like a metronome resynchronizing itself. Finally, I asked him point blank, "What are you?" His smile was patient. Not malicious, not mechanical. Just patient, like someone waiting for a thought to arrive that had long since departed. He handed me something, a small rusted key on a chain, identical to the one I'd used to open the forbidden chamber. But this one was etched with different symbols, more complex, layered, as if copied over the years by many different hands. "It only works when you forget what it opens," he said. I didn't understand. I still don't. He walked to the central comms room and activated a terminal that no one had been able to power since arrival. The screen came to life instantly, displaying a looping sonar sweep of a trench that didn't exist on any of our maps. I tried to log the data, but the feed disappeared as soon as I approached. He sat in the captain's chair like it had been molded to his spine. "You came to investigate," he murmured. "But you're too early." I asked him to explain. He shook his head. "That's not how it works. It never works, if you know the time." Then he looked directly at me and said, "I remember you." My heart stopped. We had never met. He couldn't have remembered me. But then he said my full name, and my birth date, and the name of my mother, who had died before I joined the Navy. I demanded again to know how. He replied, "Because I was here when you left." He stood, moved toward the sealed archive room, and placed the key against the panel. Nothing happened. He waited. "You're not ready yet," he said to me, and returned the key to my palm, where it felt warm. Too warm. Not like metal, like skin. I tried to detain him. He didn't resist, didn't struggle. I placed him in the auxiliary brig, a chamber used for equipment storage since the submarine had no formal detention. He sat quietly. I left him there. When I returned 2 hours later, he was gone. Not escaped. Gone. The door still locked. No ventilation wide enough for a body, no camera feed. Just the empty chain, hanging where I'd left the key. I ran diagnostics, scanned the vessel. No heat signatures, no footprints. The logs had been altered. They now listed him as never present. The intercom buzzed again later that night, and all it said was, "Don't forget what you are." I can still hear his voice behind every static pulse in this place. Each echo a perfect copy, and I don't know anymore if he ever left, or if he was ever real. But when I look in the mirror, I no longer trust the reflection. Something about my own eyes seems too blue. I'd been avoiding the torpedo bay since day one, not for lack of courage, but because every step I took in its direction felt subtly resisted by the very walls of the vessel, as if the air thickened and the steel groaned in warning. There were other rooms that disturbed me, yes, like the circular chamber behind the sealed hatch, or the radio room with its impossible Latin broadcast. But the torpedo bay was different. It was not just strange, it felt aware. On the fourth day, I finally decided to enter it, driven not by curiosity, but by an oppressive intuition that something there was expecting me. I had to descend a narrow ladder, the metal rungs freezing to the touch, even though the surrounding areas remained temperate. The access corridor narrowed unnaturally before the pressure door, as though the submarine itself had constricted around the room like a muscle tightening in pain. I braced myself and opened it. Inside, I was met with silence. Not the kind of silence that came from lack of noise, but the kind that swallowed sound whole, where even my breath seemed to dissolve before reaching my ears. The walls were lined with old torpedo brackets, rusted and hollow. Most of them were empty, their straps dangling like lifeless arms. But at the far end of the bay, where the room curved unnaturally inward like a ruptured rib cage, one cradle remained occupied. A shape, tall and oblong, was covered by a canvas blackened with mold and corrosion. The tarp pulsed ever so slightly, like a lung taking in breath from water instead of air. I froze, not because I feared what was underneath, but because some primitive corner of my mind recognized it. Before I touched it, I already knew it would be warm. I approached slowly, drawn forward not by will, but by an insidious familiarity. The tarp was damp, not from condensation, but from something thicker, something that clung to my gloves like mucus. When I peeled it back, the first thing I saw was not mechanical. It wasn't metallic. It was flesh, pale, translucent, and stretched over something that wasn't quite a shape, more of a presence forced into physical form. It looked like a spinal column had been bent into the curve of a question mark, covered in tissue too smooth, too seamless, like synthetic skin grown by mistake. No eyes, no limbs. But it pulsed in time with the humming deep within the submarine's walls, and I realized that sound wasn't mechanical at all. It was a heartbeat. There were no surgical seams, no signs of insertion. Whatever this thing was, it had grown here, thrived here. Not a passenger, but an organ, part of the vessel itself. I checked my Geiger counter. It read nothing. I tried thermal. It read below freezing. And yet, it breathed. It responded. When I placed my hand near it, a ripple coursed through the mass, as if it recognized my heat, my rhythm, my presence. Not as a threat, as a sibling. That was the moment I backed away, shaking, trying not to vomit inside my mask, because I knew, instinctively, that this wasn't alien. It wasn't extraterrestrial. It was naval, engineered, born of man. Or rather, grown after man. There was a console nearby, half sunken in condensation, blinking with dim green code. I accessed it using the override protocol given to me in the mission briefing, one I had assumed was for emergencies. The file was simple. Just a date, October 27th, 1989. A depth, 10,213 meters. And one word, in red, pulsing, exchange. There was no other data. No logs. Just that. I tried to pull backups, but the drive began to melt in place, liquefying without heat. When I turned around, the thing under the tarp was uncovered again. I hadn't done it. I swear I hadn't. But it was breathing deeper now. Thicker. As if it was waking up. I fled the torpedo bay, sealing the door behind me, keying in a lockdown protocol I wasn't authorized to use. The lights outside flickered, and for a brief moment, I heard a knock. Not from the hatch. From inside the walls. 3 knocks. Then silence. Ever since then, the submarine hums differently. The bulkheads feel warmer. Sometimes I wake to find condensation forming on the ceilings, dripping in rhythmic patterns that echo the beat I heard beside that mass. I haven't dared open the torpedo bay again, but I know it's still breathing. I feel it in my bones. And sometimes, When I close my eyes, I dream of being inside it, cradled like ammunition, waiting to be launched into a place no map has named. The radio room had long been stripped of most of its components, as though someone had attempted to gut it before abandoning the vessel. Yet what remained still felt more alive than anything mechanical had any right to be. Wires hung like vines from the ceiling, oxidized and brittle, their sheaths rotting away to reveal copper veins that pulsed with some slow, irregular current. The walls bore the marks of hastily removed panels, and on the console the main receiver blinked with a green light that hadn't been connected to power for decades. I knew this because I had traced the wiring myself earlier that day. Nothing in that room was supposed to function, and yet the static came through clearly, layered and thick like fog on a coastal morning, punctuated every few seconds by what I at first mistook for distortion, but gradually came to recognize as words. Ancient, ritualistic, spoken in a tongue that scratched the back of my memory like something I had forgotten across lifetimes. It was Latin, but not the kind I had heard in school or in the dry chants of old ecclesiastical recordings. It was older, more guttural, almost primal in its cadence. The voice was deep and inhumanly slow, as though dragged through pitch before being broadcast. I turned every dial, tuned every frequency, but the voice remained, unwavering, repeating the same phrase over and over. In tenebris sumus, et lumen mentitur. In darkness we dwell, and light is the lie. It was not a warning. It was a statement. A truth repeated into the abyss with no expectation of response. I recorded it, played it back. The waveform was irregular, and when visualized on the oscilloscope, it didn't resemble sound. It resembled a spiral. Every loop of the chant formed a deeper rotation inward, as though the voice itself were tunneling into something beneath the layers of reality. I attempted to triangulate the origin of the transmission, fully expecting the signal to loop back to the sub itself. But instead, the source location kept shifting. First marked somewhere in the Mariana Trench, then beneath the Siberian Sea, then a position unmarked by any bathymetric chart, a blind spot in satellite mapping that had never been catalogued. Each time I tried to lock it down, the location would vanish, replaced by a sequence of numbers I eventually realized were not coordinates, but dates. All in the past. All linked to naval disappearances, unexplained equipment failures, and in one instance, the sudden loss of 27 submariners, whose bodies were never recovered but whose equipment was later found perfectly stacked on a floating life raft, folded like offerings at the edge of the sea. The radio equipment began to deteriorate the longer I listened. The speaker's plastic housing cracked, slowly at first, then crumbled entirely under its own weight, as if rejecting the task it was being used for. I watched as the tuning dial spun on its own, circling back to the same frequency after each attempt to change it. I cut the power, pulled the plug from the panel, and yet the transmission continued, now resonating faintly through the very frame of the sub. I pressed my ear against the bulkhead and could feel the words vibrating through the steel, like the vessel itself had become an antenna. More disturbingly, I began to understand the phrases without translation, not because I remembered the Latin, but because I was no longer hearing them with my ears. The voice was in my mind now, whispering in a cadence that matched my pulse, as though it had hijacked my inner monologue and was scripting thoughts before I could form them myself. That night I dreamt of a cathedral built from hulls, a structure beneath the ocean where pressure did not crush but preserved, where forgotten languages were etched into the skin of vessels that had never been recovered. The voice stood at the altar, faceless and robed in darkness, and behind it, hanging like organ pipes, were the corpses of crews lost to the deep, their mouths sewn shut with copper wire, their hands raised in silent supplication. When I awoke, the chant still echoed in my ears, but more than that, I remembered singing it. I remembered my own voice joining the transmission, harmonizing with a choir I had never met but somehow belonged to. The walls of the submarine now seemed to hum in sympathy with the frequency, and I began to suspect that what we called a vessel was merely the outer layer of something else, something waiting for the right signal to rise. By morning, my fellow investigator had disabled the external antenna array, physically severing it from the tower. And yet the broadcast persisted. He swore he heard his late wife whisper his name between verses. Another claimed to see his childhood home in the oscilloscope patterns. We all heard something different. We all saw something intimate. The radio wasn't transmitting a message. It was transmitting us, rewriting us, echo by echo, whisper by whisper. I have since stopped trying to record it, not because I no longer care, but because each tape I make replays something different. None of them match what I remember hearing. Some don't even contain sound. One was filled with my own breathing, even though I hadn't spoken a word. Another played the exact moment I first boarded the submarine, but from the outside, as if something had been watching, listening, repeating. Now the chant plays without pause, and I no longer believe it is being transmitted at all. The submarine isn't receiving the frequency. It is the frequency. A resonance chamber built to house memory, thought, identity. An altar beneath the sea. And we, the investigators, were never sent to study it. We were sent to supply it. I have stopped speaking to the others. I hear enough voices already. It began not with sound, but with a change in weight. The air inside the submarine thickened, dense and damp, like the breath of something sleeping far below. At first, we thought it was condensation, a natural result of poor ventilation in a sealed metal tomb. But then the lights began to flicker, not sporadically, not randomly, but in a pattern. 3 quick pulses, a pause, 3 more. I had seen that code before. SOS, tapped out not by hand, but by the malfunctioning fluorescence overhead. The floor felt different beneath our boots, no longer hollow and dry, but softened by something that shifted slightly with pressure, almost like a shallow puddle. And then came the smell. Not the stale scent of rust and oil we had grown used to, but salt. Deep ocean salt. And something else. Something ferrous and decaying that turned our stomachs before our minds even registered the origin. It wasn't until we opened the hatch to the lower deck that we saw it firsthand. Water, dark as ink and shining with a sickly iridescence, was oozing from the ventilation shafts. Not pouring, not rushing, but flowing with impossible calm, as though gravity no longer held any dominion within the hull. One by one, the pipes began to bleed. First the auxiliary coolant lines, then the compressed air channels, and finally the sealed conduits along the torpedo corridors. We followed the trail downward, each step accompanied by the soft splash of boots sinking into cold brine that should never have existed here. No breaches, no holes. And yet the sub was flooding from the inside out. At 03:11, all clocks once again froze, and the flooding intensified. That hour had become a metronome for dread, a fixed point in time around which all chaos revolved. We gathered in the mess hall, now ankle-deep in seawater that carried with it something more than just salt. Tiny white fragments drifted across the surface, and when I scooped one from the waves, it took me a moment to realize what I was holding. A tooth. Human. Worn. Yellowed with age, and bearing the unmistakable signs of being once alive. Then came a finger joint, bloated and ivory pale, and a small shard of jawbone, still wrapped with traces of decaying gum. The submarine was bleeding memory. It wasn't just water. It was history. The pieces of a crew that had never died because they had never truly been allowed to. One of the others began screaming when he found his own wedding ring floating on the surface, engraved with a date from 2 years after he claimed he was married. He wasn't even sure it had been lost. We were watching time reverse itself in liquid form, spilling forth from walls meant to hold in pressure, not expel the past. The engine room was worst. The water there reached thigh-high, and still it climbed, but only inside. Outside, the sub remained sealed and untouched. From the deck cameras, everything looked normal. Dead, still, uneventful. But inside, we were drowning in the residue of something ancient and wrong. I ran my fingers along one of the pipes and felt a pulse, not of water, but of heat. It was alive, warm, rhythmic, like a heartbeat within metal. That's when I realized the flooding was not random. It was coordinated, pulsing in waves that moved through the ship like breath. Something was inhaling through the vents and exhaling through the drains. Something with rhythm. Something with intent. We shut every valve, sealed every access point, but still the water came, seeping through rivets and screw holes, bubbling from under sealed floor plates as if rising from a body's pores. I began to feel a strange calm, a beckoning almost. The sound of water had replaced the silence of the sub, and that sound, with its gentle sloshing, began to whisper. I don't remember when I stopped hearing voices through the radio and started hearing them in the water. But they were there, murmuring from below the surface. They didn't plead. They instructed. I watched one of my team wade into the torpedo bay, face blank, hands outstretched. He reached the bulkhead, turned to us, smiled as if something had resolved itself inside him, and then knelt slowly, submerging his head beneath the surface. He stayed there. We pulled him out after minutes passed. His lungs had not filled. There was no drowning. But he was gone. His eyes stared forward, unfocused, his mouth twitching in patterns that didn't form words but pulsed like sonar. He was repeating what the water had told him. And though I didn't understand it, I felt the meaning behind the rhythm. A call, a summons, not just to hear, but to remember, to return, to something none of us had ever seen but somehow all recognized, as if we were being drawn back to an origin buried in the pressure of the deep. The black sand floating in the water turned out not to be sand at all, but ash. Bone, ash, human, layered into the sea that now occupied every corridor, every chamber, every inch of our lungs. We were no longer aboard a submarine. We were inside an organ of something older than machines, older than nations. A vessel that was never meant to resurface. One built not to traverse the sea, but to hold something beneath it. Now the water sings. It rises even when we pump it out. And as it climbs, so too does our memory retreat. I cannot recall the names of the others anymore, only their faces. And soon, perhaps, not even those. The pressure isn't crushing us. It's transforming us. Replacing. Drowning not the body, but the self. Every drop that leaks from the vents contains another echo of what we were, and a prelude of what we are becoming. I write this now on a clipboard wrapped in plastic, hoping someone will find it, though I suspect no one will. Because when the flood finishes its work, we will no longer be something to rescue. We will be part of the water, part of the broadcast, and when the next team arrives, they will not find us. Only a ship still sealed, dry from the outside, and still ringing at exactly 03:11. We made the decision at dawn, though dawn was a theoretical thing by then, given that we hadn't seen the sun since stepping onto the dock and into the jaws of the cold, hollow machine that had pretended to be a submarine. The internal chronometers still pulsed their unyielding 03:11, and though our watches had tried to keep time, they too had now frozen, as if the very concept of sequence had buckled under the weight of repetition. We told ourselves we were leaving, that the experiment was over, that we had enough footage, enough samples, enough madness pressed into the grooves of our skin to justify retreat. We packed what little remained of our gear, most of it soaked, warped, or humming softly when no power was attached, and made our way to the main hatch. When we opened it, the air hit us like a memory we didn't know we had. Salt, windless and stale, but familiar, in a way that made our eyes water without emotion. The dock lay ahead exactly as we had left it, as if time itself had held its breath in our absence. And yet, something didn't align. The angle of the shadows was wrong. The gulls, the ones we remembered seeing circling overhead, were missing. Not dead. Just absent, like actors in a scene already filmed. We stepped onto the dock and felt relief wash over us, real and heavy, like breaking surface after too long underwater. We spoke little, walking toward the rusted chain-link gate at the perimeter of the compound. Each of us imagined what came next. Debriefings, silence, home. We reached the gate, passed through the opening, and then we were back at the submarine. Not in the metaphorical sense, not in a dream or a confusion of memory. We were physically standing before it again, facing the gangway, the open hatch beckoning us inward. Our footprints were still wet on the metal, leading away, yet here we were, returned without movement, deposited like offerings back into the hands of a machine that was no longer a vessel, but a trap. My stomach twisted in denial, but the others didn't even react, as if some part of us had already suspected. We tried again. We turned away, walked together, 5, 10, 20 paces, and again we crossed the invisible thread that unraveled our distance and rewove us at the point of origin. The submarine stood unchanged. The water clung to the walls. Inside, the flood had receded, yet the scent remained, that mixture of salt, iron, and something microbial that didn't belong on this planet's surface. We tested the radios. Static. We fired a flare upward. It rose, and then, without sound or drift, it vanished. Not exploded, just erased, like data, overwritten. One of the crew, Stevenson, began to laugh. He pulled off his boots and walked barefoot into the hull, claiming he was just going to find his journal. We didn't follow him. When we entered 20 minutes later, He was gone. But a sixth pair of boots sat by the door, old, mildewed, but unmistakably marked with the faded initials of a crewman we had never met, or perhaps once had. The concept of sequence became unstable. Each attempt to leave resulted in a return to the same point. Even when we tried to remain still, to do nothing but wait, the result was the same. One blink too long, one breath held too deep, and we'd find ourselves walking up the same gangway, stepping over the same coiled rope, hearing the same low groan of steel beneath our feet. We began to mark the walls, scratches, paint, symbols. They always vanished, or sometimes they appeared before we had made them. My own handwriting began to show up in places I hadn't reached yet, quoting thoughts I hadn't yet had. I tore a page from my notebook and slid it under a sealed hatch, only to find it pressed into my boot an hour later, folded with the ink smeared and rewritten. There was no linearity anymore, only the illusion of movement, like frames of a film played out of order, but always leading to the same shot. Auto 3:11. The clocks never advanced. Our hunger came and went in cycles disconnected from biology. Sleep arrived in fits, but never offered rest, and our dreams were filled with impossible loops. Doors opening into the same room, corridors folding back into themselves, voices speaking in reverse then repeating forward, word for word. Worse than the loops were the near loops, moments that almost changed. A coffee cup in the wrong place. A hatch that had once squeaked now silent. The sound of water where there was none. Each false variation reminded us that this wasn't a perfect cycle. It was a decaying one. Fragments diverged with each pass. I woke once to find my hands stained with ink from a pen I hadn't used in days, and my notebook filled with entries dated in years that hadn't happened. One read, Loop 11. Identity bleed worsening. Do not trust reflections. I had no memory of writing that, but the handwriting was mine. I looked in the mirror and saw my own face, yet older, tired, the edges of the irises not quite aligned, like a photo with the exposure misprinted. I began to notice the others flickering, not disappearing, but jittering between postures, positions, even moods, as if the simulation couldn't keep track of which version of them was current. Conversations repeated with slight differences. Laughter arrived seconds after jokes. The submarine wasn't trapping us in time. It was distorting the recording of it. The theory emerged unspoken. We were inside a memory loop, not our own. The submarine, or whatever had reanimated it, was not replaying events. It was digesting us into its narrative. And every attempt to escape only fed it more data to reshape us. We tried burning the walls. Nothing caught. We tried flooding it completely. The water vanished after an hour. We tried ending ourselves. One of us took that path, and yet the next morning, he was at the breakfast table, eating canned peaches, humming a tune that hadn't existed before. We stopped asking questions. Questions imply you still believe in answers. Now the only thing we hope for is entropy. Real, irreversible collapse. But even that seems denied to us. The only break from the pattern is the sound that returns every fourth loop, a low hum through the floor, followed by the same voice on the intercom. A child, whispering in Latin, the same phrase over and over. I've translated it 100 times. It always comes out different, but the core remains. You are not the first, you are not the last, you are the recording, and then we walk out again, and return, again. The first thing I noticed was the badge. It wasn't mine. It was on my uniform, clipped just as I always left it. But the name was slightly off. My last name spelled with a single letter altered. An E instead of an A. A detail so small I might have dismissed it as a printing error, if it weren't for what followed. The others, Harlow, Singh, and Ramirez, each began to comment on strange anomalies in their access logs and credentials. Singh's ID no longer opened the comms bay, where she'd spent most of her time. Harlow's biometric login triggered a lockdown. Ramirez tried to radio headquarters and got a rejection signal. Invalid authorization. Personnel not recognized. We dismissed it at first as a systems glitch, but then Singh pulled out her physical dossier, the one issued to her at deployment, and found that her own photo had been replaced. Same face, but subtly younger, wrong haircut, different scar on the cheek. She hadn't noticed until now. I checked mine and saw nothing, at first. But when I scanned the embedded chip for metadata, the timestamp of creation read 2 days ago. I hadn't received anything new in weeks. Then came the discovery in the archive room. A sealed file cabinet that hadn't been there the day before. Inside were folders, thick with aged paper, each marked with a red symbol I had never seen before. One folder per crew member, including me. But the names on those files were unfamiliar. A bizarre blend of first and last names, stitched together from different languages and origins. None matching anyone on the mission manifest. We laughed nervously, joked about identity theft, until we found the photos. Inside my file was a man that looked like me, but not quite. His nose was crooked. My nose wasn't. His hands bore calluses in the wrong places. The file said he was born in Reykjavik in 1961. I was born in Boston in '73. Singh's file claims she died in 2002 during a mining expedition in Kazakhstan. She was standing right next to me, reading it. Harlow's dossier was a simple black page with one word: returned. The comms finally went dark after that. Even the emergency beacon, hardwired to external satellites, received no acknowledgement. It was as if the world no longer registered our existence. We tried to access the ship logs for our arrival. The entry logs we signed, our deployment orders. Nothing. Every digital record of our presence was erased. The naval system didn't know we were aboard. It didn't know we were alive. Singh tried logging into her cloud archive using satellite relays. She got a single message back from an encrypted channel she claimed hadn't been active in years. The message was simple: replacement protocol initiated. We gathered in the captain's quarters, speaking in low voices, exchanging fears we didn't want to give form. The idea crept slowly, but it was undeniable. The longer we stayed inside that submarine, the more it stripped us of our lives, not just physically, not just records, but our stories, our timelines, our continuity. It was as if the vessel had a memory of its own and was replacing ours with it. Sometimes, when I caught glimpses of myself reflected in the stainless steel walls, I swore I looked slightly off. My left eye no longer lazy, my temple scar fading. Details I thought I knew were mutable, elastic. I began to forget my brother's name. I hesitated when I tried to remember the face of the woman I'd loved. In dreams, I was in rooms I'd never been, with people I had never met, wearing a uniform that had a symbol I didn't recognize. One night, I woke up and found my own handwriting in the margins of a logbook I didn't own. It said, "Don't trust the mirrors. You are no longer the original." I checked the signature at the bottom. It matched mine, letter for letter. But I had never written it. The truth did not come to us in revelation. It bled through cracks, whispers in corrupted logs, symbols burned into the back of our minds, and anomalies too persistent to be coincidence. We stopped sleeping regularly, our dreams contaminated by images not our own. Men in cold metal chambers, silent rituals beneath the waves, a pulse that beat beneath the ocean floor like the heart of something buried alive. It was Singh who pieced together the first coherent theory, her hands shaking over yellowed Cold War reports we found locked in a hidden subcompartment under the torpedo bay floor. The documents were fragile, half-burned at the edges as if someone had tried to destroy them before hiding the rest. There were mission logs dated 1971, referencing a classified operation codenamed Operation Icor. The submarine we stood in, once believed lost, had been part of a clandestine American-Soviet joint endeavor, formed during the uneasy détente of the early '70s. Their objective was not military dominance, but containment. Something had been found in the Mariana Trench. Not wreckage, not an enemy base. Something ancient, predating not just civilization but perhaps even terrestrial biology. A structure, the report called it, though the word was hastily scratched out and replaced with entity. Repeated exposure to its signal disrupted cognitive integrity. Engineers reported hearing their own names spoken in voices matching their parents', dead lovers, or in languages they never learned. The transmissions were not artificial. They were alive. And the last team to make direct contact with the signal on board this very submarine had experienced catastrophic psychological degradation. Suicide, mutiny, identity dissolution. The files didn't specify what happened next. Only that the submarine was sealed and remotely sunk by its handlers, declared irretrievable, a casualty of deep-sea pressure. But it hadn't sunk, or if it had returned. Singh found schematics that shouldn't have existed. Floor plans that matched our layout but included rooms we hadn't found. Junctions that looped in impossible geometry. The hull dimensions in the official blueprint were at least 3 meters shorter than what we had physically measured. When we followed one of the unlisted service passages, it led to a sealed compartment filled with medical equipment, rows of steel tables, all bearing signs of organic matter. Some tables still had restraints attached. On the wall was a list of test subjects. The names weren't human, at least not anymore. Latin and Greek roots combined with strings of consonants that looked almost forced, like attempts to render something phonetic that had no origin in our language. What chilled me most wasn't that this had been hidden, but that someone had maintained it. The equipment had power. The lights flickered when we entered. There was condensation on the surgical lights. Tools had been recently cleaned. Ramirez had taken to pacing, whispering under his breath words we couldn't decipher. His accent changed by the hour, sometimes German, other times Slavic. Harlow began referring to us by different names, once calling me Elias, though I never knew an Elias. He stared at Singh for 20 minutes without blinking before finally saying, "You weren't the one that came aboard." Singh, to her credit, slapped him hard enough to leave a mark. It faded within minutes. That's when we realized something worse. Injuries healed too quickly. A cut on my thumb vanished within the hour. Harlow burned his palm on a ruptured valve, and by morning there was no sign of it. But there were other changes too. Subtle at first. Our eyes adjusted to darkness unnaturally fast. I heard conversations occurring 3 rooms away. Singh stopped blinking altogether during our night shifts. We were no longer just losing our identities. We were becoming something else. I tried to destroy the files. I tried to burn the logs, flood the compartments, erase the archives. Every time I'd return later to find them intact again, sometimes rewritten in different formats, as though the ship had preserved the data through redundancy. Then came the oldest document. Handwritten, ink faded to a rust-colored hue, dated 1913. It wasn't American, nor Soviet, but English. Royal Navy. A reconnaissance vessel had gone missing in the Indian Ocean and returned a year later unmanned. The sole survivor was found delirious, tattooed with an unknown script that glowed faintly in the dark. He described a cathedral beneath the seabed that sang without air, and a pulse that made blood taste like iron and salt. The script matched carvings found in the sealed room beneath our torpedo bay. The entity hadn't been found in the 70s. It had merely been revisited. That night, I stood outside the communications bay and watched as Harlow stared into the static of the dead radio, murmuring in a frequency that no longer matched human range. When I called to him, he turned, his pupils dilated fully, and asked me why I was using his face. I backed away, tripped, and found myself in the hallway again. Not a hallway. The hallway. The one we had passed earlier but never noticed looping. I walked for what felt like hours, turning corner after corner, until I arrived once more at the entrance to the communications bay. Harlow was still staring into the static, still asking the same question, still repeating the same gesture. I began to understand. The submarine didn't just contain something. It had become something. A vessel, not just for people but for memories, for imprints, for shadows of identity that bled together across decades, crew after crew, experiment after experiment. It was no longer made of steel and wires. It was tissue, synapse, thought. We weren't investigating an anomaly. We were inside of it, and it was learning from us, and shaping us in return. I always thought that closure came with understanding, that the horror of the unknown would dissipate once we traced its shape, gave it a name, laid it bare beneath the sterile light of logic. But I was wrong. The more we learned, the deeper we sank. Not into knowledge, but into something older than comprehension. Something that operated not with facts or intention, but through erasure. Our presence here wasn't accidental. We weren't the first. We were never sent to uncover anything. We were called to complete something, to replace something. When Singh vanished, no one sounded the alarm. I think we all knew by then that we had crossed the final threshold. One moment she was standing beside me in the engine room, reading from the old logbook. The next, her shadow remained, but she did not. I say that without metaphor. The shadow lingered for hours, flickering slightly, like a projection whose source had failed. Ramirez stared at it, transfixed, muttering Singh's name like a prayer he could not stop repeating. By morning, there was no one named Singh listed on our records. No files, no prints. Her bunk was unmade. Her boots sat beside it. But her name wasn't there. and none of us were entirely sure she had ever been. Except I remembered. I remembered how she'd held the torch with both hands, how she bit her bottom lip when reading old reports, how she never blinked. And that knowledge, that memory, set me apart. It marked me. That's when I began to feel it, the slow shift, the sense that my own thoughts were being copied, diluted, rewritten, that my own voice in the log recorder came back slower, deeper, slightly off. I played it again and again. It had my inflection, my words, but not my cadence. It was as though someone was learning how to be me, perfecting it. I tried to reach out, to the surface, to anyone. I bypassed the usual comms, rerouted a signal through a buried frequency Singh had once uncovered. I sent bursts of code in intervals, begged for confirmation. No response, not even static. Just silence. A silence so complete it hummed. I opened my mouth to scream and realized the scream was already happening. But it wasn't mine. It came from inside the wall. I followed it for hours, crawling through ducts and forgotten crawl spaces until I found the source. Not a speaker, not a person, but something that looked like me, suspended in liquid, eyes wide open, mouth gaping, screaming silently. When I touched the glass, it looked back. Its hand twitched against the inside. I felt a pressure in my skull, like my memories were trying to reverse course. I stumbled backward. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my quarters. The logbook was gone. The ducts didn't exist. The only entries in the mission brief now bore my name. No mention of Singh, or Harlow, or Ramirez. Only Operative M. Decker. Except that wasn't my name. Not really. My name wasn't it? I stared at my own ID badge. It said Decker. It looked like me. The photo matched. The barcode scanned. But I remembered a childhood in Vermont, not California. I remembered a brother who died at sea, not a sister who married in Nevada. I remembered being a sonar technician. But the logs showed I was recruited as a containment analyst, specialized in neuroencoding. And none of this made sense. Unless sense wasn't the point. Unless identity was the price. I tried to escape. Packed my gear, armed the emergency buoy, aligned the sub's inertial system to auto-surface. I marched toward the hatch, airlock sequence initiated, countdown blinking in blood-red numerals. 10 seconds. 9, 8. A low vibration rumbled under my feet. 7, 6. The lights pulsed in rhythm. 5, 4. The hatch began to cycle. 3, 2, 1. The door opened, and I stepped out, onto the same platform, the same rusted dock, the same corroded railing. It wasn't the ocean's surface. It was the interior bay again, as if I had never left. My clothes were dry, my bag gone, and the logbook sat neatly on my bunk, open to a page that hadn't been there before. A sketch. Of me. Dated 2 days from now. Annotated with precise notes. Vocal patterns stabilized. Memory echo complete. Subject ready for replacement. I screamed. I ripped the page out. Burned it. Smashed every recorder, every screen, every ID terminal I could find. I bled, but the blood didn't stain. The floor absorbed it like breath, like thirst. I cornered Ramirez in the mess hall, demanded answers. Asked him who he really was. He looked up with eyes too black to reflect light and said, "You're not supposed to ask that." I turned. Harlow stood behind me, or someone wearing his face. They both repeated it. "You're not supposed to ask that." Over and over. Their mouths didn't move. The words came from somewhere deeper. I ran, locked myself in the captain's cabin, spent hours, or days, I couldn't tell, recording everything I remembered, writing it down. My name, my real name, my parents, my childhood, my enlistment, my transfer, Singh's name, her voice, her smile, her files, the cathedral beneath the sea, the submerged pulse. I wrote until the ink ran dry, until my fingers blistered. Then I sealed it in a container, shoved it behind a broken panel, and waited. No one came. When I woke, the room had changed. Or maybe I had. My hands looked older, or younger. My badge now read, Commander A. Harlow. The reflection in the glass showed his face, but I still remembered mine. Somewhere, buried beneath this skin. I opened the hatch one final time, and I saw him. Me, standing outside. My face, walking calmly down the dock toward a waiting jeep. Uniform pressed, eyes forward, ID badge clipped. He passed the guards without question. He turned once, briefly, to glance back at the vessel. At me. I tried to wave, to shout, to warn them. But my voice came out as static. My mouth opened, and only the ocean's hum emerged. Now I sit inside. Alone. The others are gone. Not missing. Gone. Like names smudged from a ledger. Their voices echo in the pipes, but not with speech. Only presence. The air tastes different now. Like rust and memory. The lights never go off. Time doesn't move. Every clock still says 03:11. The sub does not rust. It does not age. It hums. It waits. I flip through the logbook again. It's no longer handwritten. It types itself. Every entry matches my actions, my thoughts, my screams. There are pages ahead I have not yet lived. Pages describing my slow surrender. The moment I forget my own face. The day I stop resisting. The date I am declared ready. Ready for what, I don't know. But I do know this. I was never meant to leave. That was never the mission. I was meant to stay. To be written over. To be copied. The old ones have already gone. Their echoes shaped this vessel. Now it's my turn. The door behind me clicks open. The pulse grows louder. My hands move without command, typing this. Perhaps for the next one. Or perhaps just to fill the silence. Because soon, even this voice won't be mine. And someone else with my face will answer the next call.